Hello everybody, welcome to EPG Padshala. Today we'll be looking at module 3 of the paper Victimology, which is reporting behavior of victims, issues and problems. The learning objectives of this module would be to understand the socio-economic and cultural issues around reporting behavior, the 10 basic rights of victims, the significance of reporting behavior, the factors affecting reporting behavior, the reasons for non-reporting crimes, and the barriers to reporting. As an introduction to this topic, the task of portraying accurate crime statistics is made difficult by the discrepancy between the numbers of incidents reported to the police and number of people who respond positively to victim surveys. Many people respond to surveys stating that they have been victims of crime, but they did not report the crimes to the police. Knowledge of reporting patterns and the factors affecting reporting behavior is instrumental for crime prevention and control. By nature, human beings evolved shared meaning, and in this context, members of a cultural community come to construct what concepts such as offender, victimization, victim, and crime reporting mean. Therefore, it is normal for community members to attempt to evolve a set of normative reactions through a collective interpretation of acts and reactions towards lapses. This captures the collective mood of members of a community that cherishes practical social protection. The value which people place on whether or not to report a crime, the body to which it could be reported appropriately, time to do so, are all concerns wrapped up in a people's socio-cultural conditions. Culture largely determines individual reactions to everything, and particularly victimization. So the decision to report crimes is affected by interrelated complex factors such as personal characteristics of the victim, say for example gender, perceptions about the seriousness of crime incident, previous crime experiences, victim-offender relationship, the likelihood of compensation for personal harm or property damage, and also attitudes towards the police and the criminal justice system. Findings from a national victimization survey in the US indicate that violent crimes are reported for various reasons: to prevent further crimes by the offender, to stop or prevent incidents, and because they are crimes. With household crimes, an additional reason to report is to recover the property. Now let's look at the significance of reporting behavior. The decision to report crimes can have profound consequences for victims and the criminal justice system. Compensation to victims of crime and insurance payments are precluded unless the incidents are reported to the police. Again, non-reporting causes official statistics to underestimate apprehension rates, as these exclude from the denominator those offenders going undetected. It also determines which offenders are vulnerable to arrest and which are not. Furthermore, non-reporting limits our knowledge of offenders, much of which is derived from profiles of apprehended criminals. Knowing which crimes are most frequently reported helps in defining the task of police. Strategic planning operational planning, budgeting, and proper resource allocation by the police forces are dependent upon figures of reported crime. Different groups in the population may differ in their willingness to report crimes to the police. If crime experiences of people in the disadvantaged or more vulnerable groups tend to go unreported, the negative consequences of non-reporting will add to their disadvantage. Now let's move on to the factors affecting reporting behavior. Some of the following are the major determinants of reporting. First, the seriousness of the victimization experience, the possibility of claiming compensation or insurance, the victim's attitude towards the police, past behavior of victims, victim-offender relationships, victim blaming themselves, quality of service they expect to receive from the criminal justice system. Multiple or repeat victimization can affect reporting behavior in many ways. The reasons are they might be fear of the family, the suspicion, the feeling of shame, social stigma, and the co-workers not allowing the victim to lodge a complaint. The victim does not want to approach the police station because of not having support from others. Repeat victims have had unsatisfactory responses from the criminal justice system when they reported previous incidents. Repeat victims may fear or dislike the police more than single incident victims do, for obvious reasons. The types of reporting can be divided into two: the reporting to the formal system and reporting to the informal system. Reasons for reporting to the formal system could be seeking mental health services, seeking medical care. Now, there is a difference between the reporting behavior among male and female victims. Let's see how they differ. Reporting behavior among female victims, like for example victims of sexual assault, were willing to talk to others like family, friends, than to seek professional help or to use the services of the criminal justice system. They tend to report robberies but not to report assaults when they know the offender, indicating that it is a loss of property that leads them to report an incident to the police. Many incidents of assault involving women who know the offender go unreported. For example, domestic violence is certainly included within this category, therefore remaining beyond the reach of police. Now let's look at the reporting behavior among male victims. Incidents of violence with the loss of property where the offender is known to the victim tend to go largely unreported. This suggests that many of these incidents may involve close friends or relatives, possibly young people, or that property losses are not significant. Now, why do we need to report crimes to the police? There are many reasons, among which the police can answer victims' questions and discuss any concerns they have about making a report to the police. The police can explain what will happen next if the victim decides to report. The police can only take action against an alleged offender if a report is made. Also, timely reporting may prevent valuable evidence being lost or destroyed and help with any investigation that follows. If some time has lapsed since the crime, including months or years, the victim can still report the crime to the police. victim may need to have reported the crime to the police to be eligible to apply for financial assistance under the victim legislations in some countries. Let's move on to the criteria determining whether it is appropriate to report apparently criminal behavior to the police. Some of the reasons could be relevance to the public interest, the nature and frequency of the alleged offence, the frequency of the alleged offence, the risk of damage to the reputation, and also the wishes of the informant. Sometimes they are requested by the informant not to report this alleged offence to the police. Looking at informal help, two significant predisposing characteristics that emerge in research as predictors were victim age and education. With more education and younger age being associated with a greater likelihood of informal help seeking. For example, younger the victim is and more educated she is, there is a hesitation, he or she, there is a hesitation of the victim to go seek formal help, say with the criminal justice system or professional counseling. They'd rather talk to people in their own close circle, like the family, friends, and colleagues. Also, victims are more likely to report seeking help from family and friends if diagnosed with PTSD or major depression. When there is a psychological problem involved, you see that victims seek informal help instead of going to the criminal justice system. They also had a history of completed rape or other form of sexual assault. Now moving on, let's look at the barriers in the criminal justice system itself which cause non-reporting. Police would not or could not do anything. This is the perception of the victims. The outcome of research in this field has shown that these factors are the barriers to reporting. Police would not think it was serious enough. Fear of not being believed by the police. Some other reasons were fear of being treated with hostility by the police or other parts of the criminal justice system, like the lawyers, etc. Other reasons were fear or dislike of the police, fear of the legal process itself, also lack of proof that the incident had happened. Some of the victims state that they did not know how to report. Moving on to the personal barriers, there are personal barriers as well that lead to non-reporting. Too trivial or inappropriate to report to the police. Some of the victims hesitate to report to the police because they think that the crime is a very menial crime. So this causes non-reporting. They also dealt with it themselves. In case it's a minor crime, they try to deal with it themselves. They also regard it as a private matter, not a real crime, so to say. It's also not clear that harm was intended, so they do not report. They do not report because of shame, because of embarrassment, and they did not want family or others to know. Fear of reprisal by the assailant. The self-blame. Some victims blame themselves for the crime. So the self-blame also is a reason why they do not report. This is a personal barrier again. There is a desire to protect offender in a relationship if the offender is a relative or a known person, then they tend not to report. If it is children also, they tend not to report. So these were some of the personal barriers as stated by the victims that led to non-reporting of crimes. Now let's look at the rights of the victims. These rights have been classified under 4 specific heads according to the Declaration of Basic Principles for Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power, 1985. This UN declaration gives these 4 parts in which the victim assistance and services are to be included. This declaration envisages access to justice and fair treatment. It also outlines international best practices for treatment of crime victims. The developed countries have taken care of victims and incorporated these rights of victims in their local legislations. The next part is the restitution. When the court orders restitution, it orders the state to give up some gains to the claimants and to pay the claimants for his or her loss. So compensation given to the victim by the state is restitution. The next part is compensation. This is the amount or the compensation awarded to the victim by the offender himself. So it can be stated that the object of granting compensation to the victim is to alleviate the suffering of the victim, to make the loss easier to bear for the victim and his family, and also to restore their dignity. It also has an object to encourage the victim to report the crime and cooperate with the criminal justice system. The 4th part of the UN declaration deals with assistance to the victim. The state is obliged to provide public assistance to the victims by way of monetary compensation apart from granting other rights to them. These directives, though non-binding and non-judiciable, imposes obligation on the state to take positive action for the welfare of the victims. Moreover, many of the directives are elevated to the status of fundamental rights by judicial decisions. There are some general recommendations to encourage reporting. The enactment of a victim legislation that ensures victim rights as envisaged by the UN Declaration on Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power. These rights should be made enforceable like the fundamental rights in our Constitution and not remain a mere rhetoric. Also, a victim legislation should have remedies for the violation of rights and a built-in grievance redressal mechanism to ensure that the frontline professionals and other functionaries of the criminal justice system do their duties to the victims. Another most important thing is a training in victimology and victim assistance, which may be included in the academic syllabus of every police academy to increase the professionalism in this service. The involvement of NGOs in the training of the police academies and judicial academies. Another recommendation would be professional counseling has to be made available around the clock. Another important area that need for professional counseling to be made available to the police officers and the personnel to prevent secondary trauma or burnout. When these frontline professionals deal with victims day in and day out, there is a sense of secondary trauma and burnout. To counter this, these frontline professionals themselves need counseling. So this is a very important recommendation which will train the police to interact with the victims in a way that would encourage reporting. Sensitization, skill development, and capacity building of officers and other functionaries of the NGOs may also be considered. Research on all the needs of services to enable the need-based approach to victim services. Now moving on to the conclusion, it's evident that we need to increase the reporting, and in order to do this, the victims have to be encouraged to approach the criminal justice system to redress their grievances. In this aspect, the 10 rights of victims as envisaged by the UN Declaration have to be ensured. These 10 rights being the right to be treated with compassion and respect, the right to be given information, the right to present their views to the courts in the form of victim impact statements. Many developed countries which have a victim legislation have incorporated the victim impact statement in their court cases, where the victim is given an opportunity to talk about the impact of the crime on his well-being. So that's a very important right that the criminal justice system has to ensure. Then comes the right to receive free legal aid and advice. Many of the victims do not report the crime because of the anticipation that the legal system would be a very expensive way to redress their grievance, and they might not be able to afford it. So it's very important that the victims are assured free legal aid and free legal advice to encourage them to report the crime. Another important right is the right to receive protection, the right to privacy, and the right to physical safety. When the victim approaches the police station to report his crime, there is need for a private chamber in which he can talk about the crime that has occurred to him. This is very important, especially in the cases of sexual assault and where there are women victims trying to report their crime. So the physical safety is another aspect. So concentration on these aspects would also encourage the victims to report their crimes. Also, the right to informal dispute resolutions or alternate dispute resolutions. There could be informal systems for reconciliation, of mediation, which would facilitate the victim to talk about his victimization and to report his crime. Another important right is the right to receive social and medical assistance. Medical assistance in the case of sexual assault cases, and social assistance, someone who would take them through the system, accompany them to the hospital, accompany them to the courts, because the whole criminal justice system and the process is alien to most of the victims. They have no clue how it functions. So they need to have people with them, social workers who would take them through the process. So this right has to be ensured in order to increase reporting by the victims. Again, the right to obtain restitution and to obtain compensation. This is a very important right also, which encourages the victim to report his crime. Another right is a right to receive capacity building. They have victim support groups where they are encouraged to tide over their victimization, to reduce the impact of the victimization. So these are facilities made by the criminal justice system which will encourage the reporting of the criminal reporting of the victim by the criminal justice to the criminal justice system. So the last and final right of the victim would be to receive cooperation. So if the government and the agencies ensure that these 10 rights of the victims will be addressed and will be given to the victim, then the victim would be encouraged to report the crime to the criminal justice system. Thank you.